You want to know something embarrassing? I hadn't eaten in 2 days. Not because I was broke, well, I was a little broke, but that's not the point. The point is that I was so terrified, so unbearably, irrationally terrified of messing up this interview that I forgot to eat. Or maybe I didn't forget. Maybe some part of me thought that if I sat still enough, stayed small enough, didn't take up too much space in the universe would let me have this one thing. Blackwell Industries. A short, reverent exhale. Do you understand what that name meant to someone like me? I grew up reading case studies about this company in my third-year business module using a textbook that was 4 years out of date, held together with a rubber band and a prayer. I wrote my final thesis on their vertical integration strategy. I had a folder on my laptop, still have it actually, titled BW Dream, filled with articles, annual reports, restructuring analyses. My roommate thought I had a parasocial obsession with the corporation. He wasn't entirely wrong. So when the invitation landed in my inbox, plain, professional, no fanfare, I actually thought it was a scam. I read it 4 times, checked the sender domain twice, Googled the HR contact name, and when I finally accepted that it was real, I did what any reasonable person would do. I panicked so hard I forgot to eat dinner. Then I panicked through breakfast the next morning, then lunch, then dinner again, and then it was interview morning, and I was standing in front of the mirror in my best shirt, the blue one, the one I dry cleaned specifically for serious occasions, and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely do my top button. I told myself I was fine. The sound of a glass door sliding open, marble underfoot, the ambient echo of a grand lobby. The Blackwell Industries headquarters is a glass tower in the middle of the financial district, 42 floors, floor-to-ceiling windows that catch the morning sun and scatter it across the lobby in these wide gold ribbons of light. I remember walking in and thinking, I don't belong here. Not cruelly, just as a fact. The way you'd look at a cathedral and think, I am not the architecture this place was built for. The receptionist was kind. She gave me a visitor's badge and directed me to the executive floor. The executive floor, which was not where I expected a junior assistant interview to take place. And I rode the elevator up with my portfolio folder pressed against my chest like a shield. The interview room was cold, not uncomfortable, just precise, the way expensive things are. The air tasted like recycled luxury. There were 3 interviewers waiting. HR director, the department head, and a woman I later learned was the executive operations manager. I answered their questions. I think I answered them well. My voice only cracked once. I was 3 questions into the panel when the room started to tilt. A slow, nauseated pause. Have you ever had that feeling where the edges of your vision go soft, like someone's turned down the contrast on the world? That's what happened, gradually and then all at once. The HR director was mid-sentence about company culture, and I remember thinking, that's a very interesting point, and then my body just decided it was done. I don't remember hitting the floor. What I remember is a hand, firm, steady, catching my arm before I could fall, and then a voice, low, controlled, with that particular texture of someone who has never once in their life had to raise it to be heard. Someone get water, now. I blinked. The ceiling was very white, and then there was a face above me, sharp jaw, dark eyes, the kind of face that photographs beautifully but hits differently in person because you can see the way the light actually catches it. And I thought, deliriously, oh, he's real. Because I knew who he was. I'd seen his picture in those articles. CEO Adrian Blackwell, 31 years old, inherited the company at 26 after his father stepped into a chairman role. Increased revenue by 40% in 3 years, the state's most eligible and reportedly least available bachelor, which the gossip columns treated as a personal affront. He was crouching beside me on the floor of his own conference room, and his hand was still on my arm, and he was looking at me with an expression I couldn't read. Sharp, focused, almost irritated, but not at me exactly, more like he was irritated at the situation for daring to happen. "When did you last eat?" he asked. Oh no, oh no, no, no. What I thought was, please, ground, open up and take me now. What I said, in a voice approximately the texture of wet gravel, was, I had a granola bar yesterday. The silence that followed was so perfectly precise it could have been engineered. He looked at me for a long moment. I couldn't tell what he was calculating. And then he stood, straightened his jacket, dark navy, impeccably cut, the kind of fabric that doesn't crease because it knows better, and said to the room, not unkindly, but also not gently, "Interview's over. Clear the room." "Sir, we haven't." I said, "Clear it." Footsteps departing, a door closing. I was sitting up by then, back against the conference table leg, holding a glass of water someone had pressed into my hands. Adrian Blackwell was standing at the window with his back to me, hands clasped behind him, looking out at the city like it owed him a conversation. I waited. Internal. This is it. This is the part where he tells me I should have taken better care of myself and that he's very sorry, but under the circumstances. "The position," he said without turning around, "has been changed." I blinked. Changed? "You were applying for junior administrative support. That role's been restructured." He turned. His eyes found mine with the kind of directness that makes you feel briefly x-rayed. "You were applying for junior administrative support. That role's been restructured." He turned. His eyes found mine with the kind of directness that makes you feel briefly x-rayed. "I read your file before you came up. Your thesis on our vertical integration was the most structurally sound analysis I've seen from someone outside this building. You clearly want to be here." A pause. "Try to eat breakfast next time." He walked to the door. "HR will contact you with the new contract by the end of the day. Welcome to Blackwell Industries, Mr. "Liam," I said, still slightly dazed. "Liam Carter." He nodded once, like he was filing it somewhere important, and left. A long, slow exhale. I sat on the floor of his conference room for another 3 minutes. Then I called my roommate and screamed into a pillow he held up to the phone speaker. I got the job. Here is what nobody tells you about working directly for someone like Adrian Blackwell. He's not difficult. I was prepared for difficult. I had done research, naturally, and the word that came up in anonymous employee forums was exacting, which I thought I understood. I came in early. I triple-checked everything. I used color-coded tabs in physical folders because I'd read somewhere that he preferred physical briefing documents over digital ones before major meetings. I bought a second alarm clock. What I was not prepared for was the quiet. Adrian Blackwell is a man of extraordinary economy. He doesn't waste words. He doesn't waste motion. He moves through a room the way good architecture does, with intention, without announcement. You don't hear him coming, you just suddenly become aware that the air in the room has changed, that there is a specific gravitational weight being exerted from a specific direction. My desk was positioned directly outside his office, glass wall on the left, so I could always see when he was in a meeting or on a call. I told myself the glass was functional. I told myself a lot of things that first week. The coffee incident happened on day 4. I had his morning coffee, black, no sugar, which I privately considered an act of asceticism, and I was carrying it along with a stack of the morning briefing files, and I was doing fine. I was genuinely doing fine. And then he opened his office door at exactly the wrong moment, and I walked directly into his chest. Every single particle of my being left my body simultaneously. The coffee didn't spill on him. Through some act of physics that I remain grateful for to this day, it spilled entirely on me, my sleeve, my folder, the carpet in a 4-inch radius around my left foot. I stood there, coffee dripping from my elbow, and looked up. He was looking down at me. Expression? Unreadable. Eyes? Distressingly close. He was wearing a white shirt, pristine, rolled to the elbows in that particular way that should be illegal in a professional setting, and he smelled... God, he smelled... Internal. Focus. Focus. You are a professional. You are having a professional moment. He smelled like cedar wood, and something darker underneath. Amber, maybe. The kind of cologne that doesn't announce itself but follows you around afterward like a question you forgot you were asking. "I'm so sorry," I said too fast. "I'll get you a new one immediately and I'll replace the folder. The documents aren't damaged. I checked." "Liam?" His voice, quiet and even, stopped me completely. "Are you burned?" "No, it wasn't that hot." He looked at my sleeve for a moment longer than necessary. Then he said, "Get changed. There's a spare shirt in the supply closet, third shelf." And he walked back into his office. I found out later that the spare shirt was one of his. Apparently, maintenance kept one on hand. I wore it for the rest of the day like I was committing a low-grade crime. The staring started around week 2. Not me staring at him. Well, yes, also me staring at him, but that's not what I mean. I started noticing that sometimes when I looked up from my desk, Adrian was already looking. Not in an unsettling way, not in the way of someone who has been caught, in the way of someone who doesn't particularly feel the need to stop. Like he'd decided that looking was a reasonable thing to be doing, and he saw no cause for embarrassment. It was, somehow, more unnerving than if he'd looked away. The file incident was worse. We were reviewing a contract together, standing side by side at his desk, which was a large dark wood thing that smelled faintly of old paper and sandalwood, and he reached for the same page I was reaching for, and our hands landed on each other instead of the document. Time does something strange in moments like that. It doesn't stop, exactly. It just becomes very, very deliberate. His hand was warm. His fingers were longer than mine, and there was a faint callus on his right index finger that I had absolutely no business noticing. He didn't move his hand for 1 second, 2 seconds, a half-breath of a third, and then he stepped back, picked up the page from a different corner, and continued talking about the clause on page 12 as though nothing had occurred. I stood there with my hand suspended in midair for approximately 2 full seconds before I remembered that I had a body that required operating. I went home that night and had a very serious conversation with myself about professionalism. It helped for almost 48 hours. Then he leaned over my shoulder to point at something on my monitor, and I ceased to exist entirely for the duration of that interaction. The cologne. That cologne. Up close, it was... Look, I'm not going to be dramatic about it. I'm just going to say that I stopped breathing, thought about breathing, decided breathing was overrated, reconsidered, breathed, and promptly forgot everything he'd just said. He had to repeat it. He didn't seem annoyed. He seemed, and I might be imagining this, almost pleased. Probably. It started in week 3. Adrian called me into his office on a Tuesday afternoon, midweek, and said he had a business lunch and needed me to accompany him to take notes and manage follow-up items. Reasonable? Normal? I brought my notebook. The restaurant was not normal. It had a dress code. There was a maitre d' who greeted Adrian by name and led us to a corner table that had clearly been reserved in advance. The menu didn't have prices on it, which, if you've never encountered that, is the culinary world's way of saying if you need to ask, you cannot afford it. I sat down, opened my notebook, and looked across the table for the client. There was no client. There was just Adrian unfolding his napkin with perfect composure, handing me a menu and saying, "Order whatever you want." "I'm sorry, where's the client?" A brief pause. Something crossed his face, not quite guilt, more like someone who has constructed a very elegant excuse and now is obligated to deliver it. "He canceled this morning. I kept the reservation. You haven't eaten since the yogurt you had at your desk at 7:30. He noticed that? I notice most things. He opened his menu. "The lamb here is exceptional." I stared at him. He did not look up from the menu. I looked down at the menu. It was genuinely exceptional. So was the lamb. So was the dessert I did not order but which appeared at the table anyway because Adrian had apparently prearranged, which I only found out later. We talked about the Hargrove account, we talked about the restructuring proposal I'd been drafting, And at some point, without my noticing exactly when it happened, we stopped talking about work, and Adrian asked me where I was from, and I told him, and he told me he'd never been there, but his mother had once. And for a moment, his expression did something I hadn't seen it do before. Soft. Briefly, surprisingly soft. I filed that away in the part of my brain labeled things I think about when I shouldn't. The business lunches happened 5 more times over the following weeks. The clients canceled with remarkable consistency. I didn't say anything about it. Neither did he. We simply kept going to beautiful restaurants and splitting the breadbasket and talking until the afternoon turned golden outside the windows. I wasn't stupid enough to call it what it was. I was very careful not to look at him too long over the rim of my water glass, or to smile at his dry, spare wit too openly, or to let myself notice the way he watched me eat with an expression that was almost private, almost tender, almost. Friday afternoon ambiance, the winding down of an office week, then a phone ringing, late. Adrian was in Singapore for a tech summit, or he was supposed to be. He'd been there since Wednesday, which meant my Friday was relatively quiet, which meant I was packing up my desk at 5:15 feeling something dangerously close to relaxed. My phone rang. Liam? There it is, the voice that makes your cardiovascular system forget its job description. Mr. Blackwell, I wedged the phone between my ear and shoulder. Is everything all right? I thought the summit runs through... I returned early. There's a document on my home study desk, the Marchetti contract, blue folder. I need it for a 9 a.m. call tomorrow. I'm sending a car. Internal. He wants me to go to his house. I can have it couriered. I prefer you bring it. You know the file system. Internal. I know the file system. Okay, that's a reasonable. That's a professional. Of course, I said. I'll head over now. The sound of a car door, movement, then gates opening, the crunch of a long gravel drive. I want to try to describe the Blackwell house, but I'm not sure language is fully adequate. It was large in the way that spaces are large when they've been designed not to overwhelm, but to make you feel the weight of accumulated history. Stone and glass and old wood. Gardens that stretched far enough that you couldn't see the boundary wall from the entrance. The front door was dark oak, enormous, and it opened before I could ring the bell. Adrian was standing in the doorway. He was not in a suit. Internal. He was not in a suit. Gray sweatpants, a white t-shirt, soft and clearly worn in, slightly too large, falling off one shoulder in a way that I would like to formally file a complaint about. His hair was loose. It's usually precisely combed back, and loose it fell slightly across his forehead, and I needed a moment. I needed a private moment that I did not get because he was looking directly at me. Come in, he said. I'm making dinner. You cook? The corner of his mouth did the thing again. Don't sound so surprised. I found the folder in the study. It was exactly where he'd said. The blue one, though I noticed that the desk was very organized and not at all the kind of situation where a document would be difficult to locate. And when I came back to the kitchen, Adrian was at the stove, and something smelled extraordinary, and the light was going golden outside the window. I should have left. I should have set the folder on the counter and said, "Have a good evening, Mr. Blackwell. I'll see you Monday," and walked back to the car. Instead, I stood in the doorway and watched him cook, and he handed me a spoon and asked me to taste the sauce. And I tasted it and said, "It's perfect." And he said, "Sit down then." And I sat down. And then it started to rain. Rain. The real kind, sudden, sheeting, the kind that appears without preamble and commits fully to its task. The sound of it on the roof was immediate and total, the way summer rain is. One moment quiet, next moment the world had become percussion. Adrian looked at the window without alarm, and then at me, with that expression I was beginning to recognize, the one where he'd already decided what he wanted and was simply waiting to see how long it would take for the rest of the world to catch up. The car shouldn't drive in this. Stay for dinner. I don't want to impose. Liam. There it was again. Just my name. Just those 2 syllables in that voice, and I folded like origami. Yes, Mr. Blackwell. Adrian. A breath. Adrian. We ate at a table in a kitchen that was warm while the world outside dissolved into water and sound, and he refilled my glass before I asked, and I told him about my mother's cooking, and he listened with his full attention, the way he does everything, completely. And at some point I realized that I was laughing, genuinely laughing at something he'd said, and he was watching me laugh with that look, that quiet, specific, dangerous look. I stopped laughing. He didn't look away. Heartbeat. The rain didn't stop for 2 hours. He lent me a shirt to replace my damp one, soft gray, his, oversized, warm from a cabinet that clearly hadn't been opened in a while. And I changed in the downstairs bathroom and looked at myself in the mirror and had a conversation with my own reflection that was mostly incoherent, but can be summarized as, "Do not fall in love with your employer, Liam, you absolute disaster." I went back to the kitchen. He looked up. His eyes moved over me, the shirt that was too big, the sleeves past my wrists, and something in his face went very still, like a held breath, like a photograph taken at the exact wrong right moment. "Suits you," he said finally, quietly. "I am in so much trouble." And then the doorbell rang. Doorbell, sharp and intrusive. Adrian frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone. He went to the door, and I stood in the kitchen with my hands wrapped around my tea mug, and I heard the door open, and then I heard a voice. Bright, deliberate, the kind of warmth that isn't warm at all. "Adrian, darling, I was in the neighborhood." A pause. Long. Significant. I didn't move. I heard her walk in, heels on the stone floor, confident, unhurried, and then she appeared in the kitchen doorway and she looked at me. She was beautiful in the way that very deliberate things are. Her name was Vivian Hart. I didn't know her name yet, but I would learn it. She took in the kitchen, the 2 dinner plates, the open wine, the rain-wet atmosphere, and then she looked at me in his shirt, and her expression did something precise and final, like a calculation completing. She smiled. "How cozy," she said. The smile didn't reach her eyes. It was never going to reach her eyes. A slow, dread-soaked beat. And I understood, in the way that the body understands danger before the mind can name it, that something had just begun that I was not going to be able to stop. Rain again. It seems unfair that rain keeps appearing in the bad moments too. This one is 2 weeks later. It is also a Tuesday. Tuesdays have not been good to me. Let me tell you about Vivian Hart. Her father and Adrian's father, Gerald Blackwell, had been friends for 30 years. Old money meeting older money, the kind of friendship that gets conducted in private dining clubs and carved into business deals. Vivian had grown up understanding that she would have what she wanted because she had always had what she wanted. And what she currently wanted was Adrian Blackwell. Not for love. I want to be clear about that. I don't think Vivian Hart loves Adrian. I don't think she's capable of love in the way that most people understand it. What she wanted was the merger, the name, the architecture of a perfect, powerful life. And she had decided Adrian was the missing load-bearing wall. She had been to the house 3 times in the 2 weeks since that evening, always unannounced, always friendly, always warm in that precise, engineered way. Adrian was polite to her. Adrian is polite to everyone. But there was a distance in him that I recognized because I'd watched him at negotiations, and that distance is what Adrian looks like when he has already decided no and is waiting for the other party to arrive at the same conclusion by themselves. She wasn't going to arrive at that conclusion by herself. I found out later, much later, from Adrian, in pieces, that the night after the kitchen dinner, Vivian had called Gerald Blackwell. She told him about the shirt, about the dinner, about the overly familiar comfort of the scene she'd walked into. She told him, and this is the part that matters, that the assistant was a distraction, a complication, that Adrian was clearly too attached to keep professional perspective. Gerald Blackwell is not a cruel man. I want to say that because I think it's important. He is controlling and old-fashioned, and he loves his son in the way of men who don't fully know how to love their sons, loudly, directively, with the best intentions worn as armor. He wanted Adrian settled, stable. Vivian was known, was safe, was a known quantity in a life that Gerald already understood. I was an unknown. I was a variable. I was to Gerald Blackwell a problem being solved by Vivian's phone call. Adrian was in Houston. He'd told me Monday morning, crisp and businesslike in the elevator, that he'd be gone until Thursday, Houston for a joint venture meeting. He'd left me with a full week's schedule and a travel folder and the specific, slightly stern instruction that I eat lunch, not just coffee. Internal. I know. I make terrible decisions when I'm nervous. It was Tuesday when HR called me upstairs. Not my floor, the 28th floor, where Gerald Blackwell kept his chairman's office. I'd never been there. It smelled different from Adrian's floor. Older, heavier, like the building had been holding its breath for a long time. Gerald Blackwell was exactly what you'd imagine from the name. Broad-shouldered, silver-haired, the posture of a man who had never once questioned whether he was entitled to the chair he was sitting in. He looked at me the way people look at furniture they've decided to rearrange. He wasn't alone. Vivian was seated in the chair to his right, her legs crossed, her hands folded, her face arranged in an expression of practiced, sympathetic neutrality that was somehow the most threatening thing in the room. "Mr. Carter," said Gerald. "Sit down." The creak of a chair, rain against a window. I want to tell you what was said in that room word by word, but I don't think I can. My memory of it has the specific texture of trauma. Certain words in high relief, the rest in soft blur. I remember Gerald saying phrases like reorganization, conflict of interest, and professional boundaries. I remember him looking at me not unkindly, but with the settled certainty of someone who has already signed the paperwork. I remember Vivian not saying a word. That was the worst part. She sat there entirely silent, watching me with those bright, patient eyes, and her silence said everything her voice didn't need to. She'd already done her work. This was just the aftermath. "We're terminating your contract effective immediately," Gerald said. "You'll receive a month's severance and a strong reference." Can I ask why? Specifically because my performance reviews have been, "This isn't about performance." A pause. He looked, briefly, uncomfortable. "Good. Adrian will be informed when he returns. You're free to go." The sound of rain, harder now. I stood up. I picked up my bag. I'd brought my bag, reflex, like I'd known somehow, and I looked at Vivian, and she looked at me, and she smiled. Not the bright engineered smile, something smaller, private. The smile of someone ticking a box. I walked out. I took the elevator down. I cleared my desk. It took 11 minutes, which meant I hadn't accumulated much, which felt like its own particular sadness. And I put on my coat, and I walked out of the Blackwell Industries building, and the rain hit me immediately, hard and cold. And I stood on the pavement and let it for a moment. Rain. Just rain. Because where was I going to go? I had spent the better part of a year building something here, not just a job. I know what I should say. I know the professional, measured thing to say is that it was just a job, but it wasn't just a job. It was the company I'd dreamed about since I was 19 years old, sitting in a lecture hall with a rubber-banded textbook. It was the work I was good at. It was the lunch meetings and the file system I knew better than anyone, and the way he said my name like it meant something. It was Adrian. God, it was Adrian. And I couldn't even tell him. Because what would I say? Your father fired me, and the woman he's trying to marry you to sat and watched, and I stood there and let it happen, and I think I'm in love with you, and I've been in love with you since you crouched on the floor of a conference room and asked me what I last ate. I took the bus home in wet clothes. I didn't need dinner. He found out when he landed. His phone, as it came off flight mode, produced 17 messages in rapid succession. From HR, from his assistant director, from 2 colleagues who apparently felt he should know sooner rather than later. He read them on the tarmac. He was home within the hour. I didn't know any of this yet. I was in my apartment, in dry clothes, eating cereal at 10 p.m. and trying to feel normal. What I know is this. Gerald Blackwell had organized a family dinner for Thursday evening. Ostensibly a welcome home dinner. Vivian was there, dressed for an occasion. The table was set formally. The mood was celebratory in the way of people who have decided an outcome and are waiting for everyone else to agree. Adrian sat through the first course. He let Gerald talk, let Vivian smile across the table, let the conversation move toward the future, toward the merger, toward the word arrangement that kept appearing like something Gerald thought was a compliment. He waited until the second course. A beat of immense quiet. And then he set down his fork. "I want to know," he said, and his voice by all accounts was entirely level, "which one of you made the call?" The table went still. Gerald started on Adrian. This was a business decision. It wasn't a business decision. Not loud, just final. It was a threat, dressed in bureaucratic language and executed while I was out of the country, because whoever arranged it knew I wouldn't have allowed it. Vivian said something composed, something about professional complications and for Adrian's own good. And Adrian looked at her, and apparently the look was enough to stop her mid-sentence. Then he looked at his father. And this is the part I keep coming back to. This is the part that when he told me later, I had to ask him to repeat because I needed to hear it twice. He said, "I built everything you handed me. I grew it. I gave this company a decade of my life, and I never once asked you to give me something in return. I am asking you now, stay out of my life, or I will walk out of this one and I will not look back. Not for the company, not for the name, not for anything." A silence. Absolute. And then he stood up, folded his napkin, placed it precisely on the table, and walked out of the dining room. Gerald Blackwell, I'm told, sat very still for a long time after the door closed. Then he said, quietly, to no one in particular, "He's too much like his mother." Which, I think, was the closest Gerald Blackwell had come to a compliment in years. Footsteps. A door. The sound of a car. I didn't know any of this. I was asleep by 11, having decided that tomorrow I would update my CV. My phone buzzed at 11:47 p.m. A text. One line. "Don't make any decisions yet. A." Internal. I read it 4 times. Then I sat up. Then I read it again. I didn't sleep after that. Bird song. Warm air. The sound of the ocean close. He called me on a Saturday morning and said, "I need you on an overseas business trip. Tuesday. Pack for a week." "A business trip?" I repeated. "Yes." "Where?" A slight pause. "Santorini." Internal. Santorini. I should have asked more questions. I should have asked who the client was, what the meeting agenda was, whether I needed to prepare briefing documents, all the normal professional things. What I said was, "Is there a client?" A longer pause this time, and then in a voice that was precisely what it would sound like if Adrian Blackwell ever let himself be almost vulnerable. "No." Silence, the kind that stretches. "Adrian." "I'll explain when we get there. Pack light. The weather is warm." He hung up. I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the wall for a while. Then I started packing. The sound of a plane. Then warmth. Bright light. The brilliant, slightly unreal blue of the Aegean. The resort was... Look, I grew up in a town where a nice dinner out meant the good pasta place on the high street, so my frame of reference for luxury is not extensive. And even accounting for that, the resort was extraordinary. white stone and bougainvillea, and a pool that appeared to be suspended directly over the sea. Our rooms were adjacent. He'd booked them, obviously. And from my terrace, I could hear the water and the wind, and nothing else. The first day was quiet. We walked. Adrian bought me lunch at a place with a blue-striped awning where they brought bread before you asked, and the olive oil was extraordinary. And we talked. Really talked. The way we had started to do in those lunch meetings. About small things and large things, and the things in between. He asked about my plans. I said I wasn't sure. He went quiet in a way that meant he was deciding something. I kept waiting. I kept waiting for him to tell me what this was. I kept waiting for the conversation to happen, and every time I thought it was coming, he'd redirect, refill my glass, point out a boat on the horizon. He was stalling. Adrian Blackwell, who is the most decisive man I have ever met in my life, was stalling. The second evening we had dinner on a terrace overlooking the caldera. The sun was going down in that particular Mediterranean way, slow, extravagant, spreading itself across the water in long bands of orange and rose. Candles on the table, the smell of sea salt and thyme. He was quiet through most of dinner. I watched him watch the water, and I thought about all the small things. The hand on my arm in the conference room, the shirts, the lunches with no clients, the rain in the kitchen, and the way he'd said, "suits you," while looking at me in his shirt. The 17 messages on a tarmac, "don't make any decisions yet." I thought about the version of myself that had walked into this company hungry and overwhelmed, and sure he didn't belong there, and I thought about how I'd gotten here. This terrace, this sunset, this man who still wouldn't look at me directly, but who had nevertheless dragged me across an ocean to... "You're staring," Adrian said without looking up. "You stare at me all the time." A pause. He looked up. Heartbeat. Loud. Present. We looked at each other across the table in the dying light, and all the careful professional distance that we had both been maintaining, all the meticulous not saying things, all the performed obliviousness, it was all still there, technically. Technically, we were still an employer and a recently terminated and still unclear situation employee having a dinner abroad for unspecified reasons. But we were also just Adrian and Liam. And the sun was going down, and neither of us was pretending any more that there was somewhere else either of us would rather be. He set down his glass. "I've been trying to figure out," he said slowly, "how to do this correctly." "Do what correctly?" "Tell you." A pause, a long one in which his jaw did the slight tighten it does when he's choosing words the way other people choose weaponry, carefully, deliberately. "I'm not good at this. I want to be clear about that from the start. I don't do this. I've never wanted to do this with anyone enough to bother." "Do what?" I asked again, quietly. My heart was doing something cartographic, mapping a territory it hadn't had a name for until this moment. He looked at me directly. "Want someone this much." The sea, the light, the silence. Internal. Oh. Internal. Oh, you stubborn, infuriating, brilliant man. You faked business lunches. You left a document on your desk on purpose. You made it rain. You said my name like that every single time, like you were keeping it somewhere. "How long?" I asked. My voice was very quiet. Something in his expression shifted. Not the careful CEO face. Something underneath. Something unguarded and slightly helpless, and in its helplessness, more devastating than anything I'd ever seen on him. "Since the conference room floor," he said. "You were holding a glass of water and you looked up at me and said you'd had a granola bar the day before, and I thought..." A pause. Almost rueful. "I thought, I need to make sure this person is fed." And then it turned into all of this. I laughed. I couldn't help it. It came out soft and slightly watery, and he looked at me with a startled expression, like my laughter was a thing he'd wanted to collect evidence of. "You gave me the executive assistant position because you wanted to make sure I ate lunch?" You gave me the executive assistant position because you were the most qualified applicant. The lunch was—" He stopped. "An added benefit." Adrian. Liam. The way he said my name, even now, especially now, with the candles and the sea and no professional context requiring anything of either of us, he still said it like he was filing it somewhere important, somewhere he intended to keep it. I stood up from my chair. He watched me, tracking, careful, slightly braced in the way of someone waiting for a verdict, and I walked around the table and I stood beside him, and he turned in his chair to face me, and we were close. Closer than the file cabinet and the coffee incident and the cologne ambush had ever managed to arrange, and I could feel the warmth of him, and I could see the specific, precise, uncharacteristic nervousness in his eyes. Internal. Adrian Blackwell is nervous. Adrian Blackwell, who has never needed to raise his voice in a boardroom, who built an empire at 26, who walked out of a family dinner with one sentence that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. He is nervous. For me, about me, because of me. "Ask me," I said. He looked at me. "Will you—" He stopped. Started again. "I want you in my life, not as an employee, not in a professional capacity. I want—" His voice dropped, and it went quieter and more Adrian than I had ever heard it, which is to say, it went quiet all the way down to something real and unshielded. "I want to be the person who makes sure you eat, who you call when something's difficult, who gets to watch you laugh. A breath. I want to be yours, if you'll have me." The sea said something below us. The candle flame moved without wind. I looked at him for a long moment. This man who had caught me on a conference room floor and changed my job title and ordered desserts in advance and faked every business lunch and staged a forgotten document and made it rain and worn his heart so quietly, so privately, so stubbornly, sewn into the lining of every small careful action he'd ever taken in my direction. "Yes," I said. Simple. Just that. "Yes, Adrian." He exhaled. It was the most human sound I had ever heard him make, like something he'd been holding for a very long time had finally, gently been set down. He reached up, slowly, like he was giving me every opportunity to object, and his hand found the side of my face, warm and steady. And I leaned into it, because I had, apparently, been leaning toward this man since the moment I woke up on the floor of his conference room and found him already there. The sound of the sea, the last of the sun, the warmth of a hand. I came here for a job. I brought a portfolio and a color-coded folder system and 2 days of anxiety-induced starvation and a second-hand textbook that I loved like it was scripture. I came for a job. I left with everything else. The end.